The afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows of Pelham House, casting golden rectangles across the Persian carpet in the drawing room. Lady Isadora Pelham sat with practiced elegance on the edge of a velvet settee, her spine straight as a royal guardsman's, her hands folded primly in her lap. But beneath the facade of composure, irritation simmered like water on the verge of boiling. He was late. Absurdly, inexcusably, unforgivably late. Isadora's gloved fingers drummed against the arm of the settee, a rhythm that matched the ticking of the ornate clock on the mantelpiece. 3 o'clock had come and gone nearly 40 minutes ago. Her mother, the Marchioness of Whitmore, had excused herself 20 minutes earlier with a knowing smile that Isadora found intensely annoying. Even the servants had begun to exchange furtive glances as they passed through the corridor, their footsteps quieter than usual, as though they could sense the storm brewing in their young mistress. "Perhaps the Duke has reconsidered," her lady's maid Agnes suggested gently from her position near the door, where she'd been standing for the better part of an hour. Isadora's blue eyes flashed dangerously. "If the Duke of Northmere has reconsidered, he should have the courtesy to send word rather than leave us waiting like merchants at a shop counter." She rose abruptly, her silk skirts rustling with the sharp movement. "This is intolerable, absolutely intolerable." At 20 years old, Lady Isadora Pelham had never been kept waiting for anything in her life. As the only daughter of the Marquis of Whitmore, she had been indulged from the cradle. Her nursery had overflowed with dolls from France and music boxes from Switzerland. Her governess had been the most accomplished in London. Her coming-out ball had been the event of the season 2 years prior, with 300 guests and an orchestra brought from Vienna. She had rejected 3 proposals from perfectly suitable gentlemen simply because their conversation bored her, or their estates weren't grand enough, or their political connections weren't impressive enough. And now she was expected to marry a man who couldn't even arrive on time for their first formal meeting. Isadora paced the length of the drawing room, her heels clicking against the polished floor. She'd spent the entire morning preparing for this encounter. Her lady's maid had arranged her dark hair in an elaborate style that had taken over an hour. Her dress, a confection of blue silk that matched her eyes perfectly and had required 3 fittings, had been selected specifically to make an impression. She'd even practiced the exact arch of her eyebrow that conveyed aristocratic disdain while maintaining perfect politeness. She had been ready to put the Ice Duke firmly in his place. Isadora had heard all the stories about Leander Vaux, the 6th Duke of Northmere. At 32, he was considered one of the most eligible bachelors in England, if one could overlook his legendary coldness. The gossip said he cared more for his ledgers than for people, that he managed his vast estates with ruthless efficiency, but had never been seen to smile at a ball. Lady Pemberton had claimed he'd danced with her daughter exactly once, and hadn't spoken a single unnecessary word beyond basic courtesy. Mrs. Hartley swore he'd cut short a house party at his own estate because he found the frivolity tedious. Some whispered he had a broken heart buried beneath that icy exterior, that some great tragedy had frozen him into stone. Others claimed he simply had no heart at all, that he was as cold and calculating as they came. "A match made in heaven," Isadora had said dryly when her father announced the arrangement 3 weeks ago. "The Ice Duke and the spoiled Marchioness's daughter. I'm sure society will be positively aquiver with anticipation." Her father, the Marquis of Whitmore, had given her a stern look over his newspaper. "You could do far worse than the Duke of Northmere, Isadora. His fortune is second only to royalty. His lands stretch across 3 counties, and his reputation is impeccable. He's never been touched by scandal. He manages his affairs with admirable competence, and the connection would be highly advantageous for our family." "How thrilling," Isadora had replied, examining her nails with studied boredom. "I shall expire from the sheer excitement of marrying a man who sounds duller than yesterday's newspaper." Her mother had intervened then, as she always did. "Darling, you're 20 years old. You've rejected 3 perfectly acceptable gentlemen. Your father is beginning to lose patience, and frankly, so am I. The Duke of Northmere is an excellent match. You'll be a duchess, for heaven's sake. You'll outrank nearly every woman in London. And his estates, Isadora Northmere Castle, is magnificent. You'll want for nothing, except stimulating conversation and a husband who might actually notice I exist," Isadora had muttered, but she had agreed, as she knew she must. At 20, with 3 rejected proposals behind her and a reputation for being difficult, even her indulgent father was beginning to make noises about her future. And truthfully, being a duchess held considerable appeal. She would outrank nearly every woman in society. She could host the most spectacular balls. Northmere Castle was said to be one of the finest estates in England, and if the Duke proved as cold and business-minded as rumoured, he would likely leave her to her own devices once an heir was produced, which suited her perfectly well. So she had spent the past week preparing. She had selected her most impressive wardrobe. She had practiced witty remarks and cutting observations. She had memorized interesting facts about art and literature and current events so she could demonstrate her superior education. She had been ready to show the Ice Duke that she was no simpering debutante who could be ignored or dismissed, and the wretched man hadn't even had the courtesy to arrive on time. 45 minutes, Isadora announced, checking the clock again. 45 minutes past the appointed hour. This is beyond rude. This is... The sound of carriage wheels on the gravel drive made her pulse quicken despite herself. Isadora hurried back to the settee and arranged herself in a pose of studied indifference, picking up a book she had no intention of reading. Voices in the entrance hall, her father's deep tones welcoming and cordial. A man's voice responding, lower, controlled, with an edge of something Isadora couldn't quite identify. Apology? Weariness? There was something rough about it, as though he'd been shouting or perhaps hadn't slept. Then footsteps approaching the drawing room. Isadora prepared to launch into her carefully rehearsed speech about punctuality and respect, and the basic courtesies expected between civilized people. The door opened, and every word she'd prepared evaporated like morning mist. The Duke of Northmere was taller than she'd expected, with broad shoulders that filled his impeccably tailored black coat. His dark hair was swept back from a face that could have been carved from granite, all sharp angles and stern lines, with a strong jaw and a mouth set in what looked like permanent disapproval. His eyes were grey as a winter sky, and currently they held an expression that looked almost like desperation. But it wasn't the Duke who arrested Isadora's attention and stole every cutting remark from her tongue. Clinging to his hand, half hidden behind the folds of his coat, was a small child. The little girl couldn't have been more than 5 years old. Golden curls tumbled around a heart-shaped face, dominated by enormous blue eyes currently swimming with tears. She wore a pretty white dress with a blue sash that matched her eyes, but it was rumpled and creased, as though she'd been crying into it for some time. Her small hand gripped the Duke's larger one with desperate intensity, her knuckles white with the force of her grip, and she kept her face pressed against his leg, as though trying to disappear into him entirely. Isadora's prepared speech died on her tongue. She found herself rising automatically, all her rehearsed hauteur forgotten in the face of such obvious distress. "Lady Whitmore, Lady Isadora," the Duke said, his voice rough and strained. He bowed, as perfectly as one could while attached to a terrified child. "Please forgive my tardiness. I encountered some difficulty this afternoon." Her father, following behind, cleared his throat. "May I present His Grace, Leander Vaux, the Duke of Northmere. Your Grace, my daughter, Lady Isadora Pelham." Isadora curtsied automatically, but her eyes remained fixed on the child. The little girl had peeked out from behind the Duke's coat, just enough to look at her, with those enormous tear-filled eyes, and something in Isadora's chest constricted painfully. "Lady Isadora," the Duke continued, and now she could hear the exhaustion beneath the formal courtesy. "May I present my ward, Miss Tess Vaux?" Ward. Not daughter, then. But the way the child clung to him, the way his free hand came down to rest protectively on her golden curls, spoke of a bond deeper than any legal guardianship. "How do you do, Miss Tess?" Isadora said softly, crouching down without thinking about what it might do to her expensive silk dress. She brought herself to the child's eye level, something instinctive overriding all her training in proper deportment. What a lovely name. "Do you know I was named after my great-grandmother, but I always thought Tess was a much prettier name than Isadora." The golden curls shifted slightly as the child turned her head, just enough to peek out with one eye, studying Isadora with wary curiosity. The Marchioness had entered behind them, and Isadora could feel her mother's surprised gaze on her back. This was not how a Marchioness's daughter typically greeted a duke. This was not the carefully orchestrated first meeting they had planned, but Isadora found she didn't care. "I've been terribly nervous about today too," she confided to the child, as though sharing a great secret. "I was sitting in here, working myself into quite a state, if you want to know the truth. I even practiced looking stern in the mirror this morning," she demonstrated, arranging her features into an exaggerated scowl that made the corner of the little girl's mouth twitch slightly. "But I'm not very good at it. My nose wrinkles when I try to look fierce, and it makes me look like I've smelled something unpleasant, like old cheese, perhaps, or wet dog." A tiny, almost imperceptible giggle escaped the child. She emerged a bit further from behind the Duke's leg, her tear-stained face tilting up to study Isadora with slightly less fear and slightly more curiosity. "That's better," Isadora said warmly. "Now I can see your eyes properly. They're the most beautiful shade of blue, like cornflowers in summer, or like the sky on a perfect day. My eyes are blue too, see? But yours are much prettier." "Uncle Leander says they're like Mama's," Tess whispered, so quietly Isadora had to lean in to hear her, and just like that the tears returned, spilling down her cheeks in silent streams. The Duke, Leander, gathered her up immediately, rising to his feet with the child cradled against his chest. "Hush, darling. It's all right. Everything's all right." His large hand stroked her back in soothing circles, and the harsh lines of his face had softened into something that made Isadora's chest ache with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "I apologize," he said over the top of the golden curls, and now Isadora could hear the raw emotion beneath the formal words. "This is highly irregular. I should have sent word that I would be bringing Tess, but that is, she became quite distressed at the thought of my leaving, and He trailed off, looking suddenly lost in a way that seemed entirely at odds with his reputation for icy control. Over the top of Tess's head, his grey eyes met Isadora's, and she saw exhaustion there, and grief, and a desperate, unspoken plea for understanding that spoke of sleepless nights and endless worry, and a burden carried alone for far too long. All the cutting remarks Isadora had prepared about punctuality and respect seemed suddenly petty and small. "Perhaps," her mother said carefully, stepping forward with the social grace of long practice, "we might all benefit from some refreshment. Tea has been prepared in the garden room, which has a lovely view of the grounds, and I believe Cook has made some jam tarts that might be of interest to young ladies." "Jam tarts?" Tess's tear-soaked voice was muffled against Leander's shoulder, but there was a hint of interest beneath the misery. "Indeed," the Marchioness continued smoothly. "Strawberry jam, I believe, or possibly raspberry. I can never tell the difference, which is terribly embarrassing for a Marchioness. Perhaps Miss Tess might help us solve the mystery." The child peeked out from Leander's shoulder, curiosity beginning to overcome fear. "Both? Quite possibly. We'll have to investigate thoroughly. It's very serious business determining the difference between strawberry and raspberry jam." "Perhaps," Leander said quietly, his hand still rubbing soothing circles on Tess's back. "We might see those peacocks you mentioned in your letter, Lady Whitmore. Tess has never seen a peacock, and I thought—" "Peacocks?" Tess's head came up fully now, her tear-stained face showing genuine interest for the first time. "Real peacocks?" "Absolutely real," Isadora's father confirmed, speaking for the first time since the introductions. His stern face had softened considerably as he looked at the small, distressed child. "We have 5 of them, in fact. They're quite vain and think themselves very important. One of them likes to display his feathers on the south lawn every afternoon, as though he's putting on a show. Can we see them?" Tess looked up at her uncle with those enormous blue eyes, hope beginning to replace some of the fear. "If Lady Isadora wouldn't mind the company," Leander said carefully, and there was something in his voice, a vulnerability beneath the formal courtesy, that made Isadora's heart squeeze. "I would be delighted," Isadora said, and found she meant it. "In fact, I was just thinking this morning that I haven't named the peacocks yet, and that seems a terrible oversight. Perhaps Miss Tess might help me choose appropriate names." A small, watery smile appeared on Tess's face. "Really? Really and truly. Naming peacocks is very important work, and I'm told you're just the right age for it." Leander set Tess down gently, but the child immediately grabbed his hand again, her small fingers wrapping around 2 of his larger ones. With her free hand, however, she reached toward Isadora, her small face uncertain but hopeful. Without thinking, Isadora took the offered hand. It was tiny and warm and slightly sticky, and the feel of it in her palm made something shift and settle in her chest, like a puzzle piece clicking into place. "Shall we?" she said softly. And so they made their way through Pelham House and out to the garden room, this strange, unexpected party of adults and one small child who was the reason for all the disruption and all the lateness and all the irregularity. The garden room lived up to its name, with tall windows overlooking the manicured grounds and French doors that opened onto a stone terrace. Tea had been laid out on a low table, delicate china cups, plates of sandwiches and cakes, and yes, jam tarts with glossy red filling. Isadora's mother presided over the tea service with practiced grace, but Isadora noticed the way her eyes kept drifting to Tess with a softness that suggested the child's distress had touched even the formidable Marchioness. For the next hour, they had what must have been the strangest tea party in the history of formal courtships. The Marquis and the Duke discussed estate matters and marriage settlements in low tones, but Isadora paid them little attention. Instead, she focused on drawing out the silent child who sat on Leander's lap, still clinging to his coat, but now also clutching a jam tart, raspberry they had determined, and stealing glances at Isadora when she thought no one was looking. "That one," Isadora declared, pointing through the window to a particularly pompous-looking bird, strutting across the lawn with his tail feathers spread, "is definitely Lord Featherbottom. You can tell by the way he walks, very stately and dignified, as though he's inspecting his troops." A tiny giggle escaped Tess. "Lord Featherbottom is a silly name, isn't it? But I think silly names are much better than boring ones. That one there," she pointed to a female peacock, "is Lady Preenalot. She spends all day admiring her reflection in the pond. What about that one?" Tess pointed to a particularly colourful male displaying his feathers in full glory. That's a difficult one. He's very grand and colourful. Perhaps Prince Rainbow Feathers?" "Princess Rainbow Feathers," Tess corrected seriously, "because she's pretty." "You're absolutely right. Princess Rainbow Feathers it is." Leander watched this exchange with an expression that made Isadora's breath catch. His harsh features had softened completely, and in his grey eyes she saw something that looked almost like hope, fragile and tentative, as though he was afraid to believe what he was witnessing. Their eyes met over the top of the golden curls, and something passed between them. A wordless understanding, a connection that had nothing to do with arranged marriages or social advantage, and everything to do with the small, broken child they both wanted desperately to protect. "Would you like to go see them closer?" Isadora asked impulsively. "We could walk in the garden. I could introduce you properly to Princess Rainbow Feathers and explain all the rules of peacock etiquette." She expected the child to refuse, to cling tighter to her uncle, to retreat back into the safety of his coat. But after a moment's hesitation, Tess nodded. More surprisingly still, when Isadora held out her hand, the little girl took it. Leander looked as startled as Isadora felt. He opened his mouth as though to speak, then closed it again, emotions flickering across his face too quickly to identify. "We won't go far," Isadora assured him, though she found she was speaking more to the man than to social convention. "Just to the terrace, where you can see us from here." "I'll come with you," he said, rising. But Tess surprised them both. "Uncle Leander should finish his tea and talk to the Marquess," she announced with a child's logic. "He's been very worried about estate matters. We'll be right there." She pointed to the terrace visible through the French doors, no more than 20 feet away. Leander hesitated, clearly torn between giving the child independence and his obvious need to protect her from everything that might cause her pain. "Go on," the Marchioness said kindly, settling back with her own teacup. "We'll watch from here." "And Isadora will take excellent care of her, won't you, dear?" "Of course," Isadora said, and meant it with an intensity that surprised her. She led the small, warm hand through the French doors and onto the terrace. The June afternoon was perfect, warm but not hot, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of roses from the garden beds below. Tess walked close to Isadora's skirts, her free hand occasionally reaching out to touch the fabric, as though reassuring herself that Isadora was real and solid, and not going to disappear. "Your dress is very pretty," Tess said quietly, her small fingers brushing across the silk. "It's the colour of the sky." "Thank you. It's one of my favourites. Do you like pretty dresses?" A nod. "Mama used to have pretty dresses. Uncle Leander keeps them in a special trunk in the attic so I can look at them sometimes. He says when I'm bigger, we can have them altered to fit me, so it will be like wearing a hug from Mama." Isadora's throat tightened painfully. "That's lovely that he does that. Your uncle must have loved your Mama very much." He says she was the kindest person in the whole world, and the bravest. Tess's voice dropped to barely a whisper. She died when I was a baby. I don't remember her. Uncle Leander tells me stories, but I can't remember what she looked like except in paintings. And then Papa. Her voice broke, and the tears started again, streaming down her small face. Isadora knelt immediately, heedless of what the stone terrace might do to her expensive silk. She pulled the small body into her arms, and Tess came willingly, sobbing against her shoulder with the desperate, broken sound of a child who had lost too much, too young. "Oh, sweetheart, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." Tess's small hands fisted in Isadora's dress, her whole body shaking with the force of her grief. "I miss him. I miss Papa so much. He was sick, and the doctor said he was getting better. But then he wasn't better. He was worse. And I was reading to him from my picture book, and he just stopped. He stopped breathing and his hand went cold, and I didn't know what to do, so I kept reading because maybe if I read enough he would wake up again. But he didn't. He didn't wake up. And now he's gone forever, like Mama, and everyone I love goes away and never comes back." The words tumbled out in a rush, probably the most the child had spoken since arriving, and they broke Isadora's heart into 1,000 pieces. "Listen to me," Isadora said fiercely, pulling back just enough to look into those swimming blue eyes. "Listen carefully, Tess. Your Uncle Leander is not going away. He loves you more than anything in the world. I can see it every time he looks at you. And he's young and healthy and strong, and he's going to be here for a very, very long time. But Papa was here and then he wasn't," Tess sobbed. "What if Uncle Leander gets sick too? What if he falls from his horse like Papa did? What if he goes away and I'm all alone?" When Isadora looked up, she saw Leander standing in the doorway to the garden room, his face a mask of pain. Their eyes locked, and in that moment Isadora made a decision that would change everything. She looked back at Tess, still holding the child's small, tear-streaked face between her hands. "Then I'll be here," she said firmly. "Your Uncle Leander and I are going to be married, which means I'll be part of your family. And I promise you, Tess, I promise that you will never be alone. Even if something happened to your uncle, which it won't, but even if it did, you would still have me. Always. Forever. Promise?" The word was barely audible. "I promise. Cross my heart." Isadora suited action to words, drawing an X over her chest. "That's the most solemn promise there is." Tess studied her face with those enormous eyes, searching for truth, for certainty, for something solid to hold on to in a world that had proven itself unreliable and cruel. Whatever she found there must have satisfied her, because she nodded slowly, then collapsed back against Isadora's shoulder. They stayed like that for long minutes, Isadora rocking the child gently while stroking her golden curls. When she finally looked up again, Leander was closer, his grey eyes bright with unshed tears. "I'm sorry," he said roughly. "I should have told you, I should have explained before I came, but I didn't know how to put it in a letter, and I thought—" "You thought I'd refuse to see you if I knew," Isadora finished quietly. "You thought I'd be like all those other society ladies, who see a traumatized child as an inconvenience rather than a person deserving of love." He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Isadora rose carefully, keeping Tess in her arms. The child had cried herself into exhaustion and now lay heavy against her shoulder, hiccuping softly. "Let me tell you something, Your Grace. 3 hours ago, I was sitting in that drawing room, rehearsing cutting remarks about punctuality. I was prepared to put you firmly in your place for keeping me waiting. I thought I knew exactly who I was and what I wanted." She stepped closer to him, close enough to see the fine lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and constant worry. "But the moment I saw this little girl, everything changed. She matters more than punctuality, more than social convention, more than any of the petty things I thought were important." "Why?" The question was barely audible, raw with vulnerability. "Because she's hurting. Because she's lost everything and she's terrified of losing more. Because when I look at her, I don't see an inconvenience or a complication. I see a child who needs to be loved fiercely and protected completely and shown that the world can still be safe." Isadora paused, then added softly, "And because the way you love her tells me everything I need to know about who you really are beneath that ice-duke facade." Something in Leander's face cracked open. "I love her as though she were my own daughter," he said hoarsely. "Thomas, my brother, asked me to take care of her if anything happened to him. I thought it was just worry, just his grief over Caroline talking, but he made me promise, and then 4 months later he was dead, and Tess was alone and traumatized, and His voice broke. I'm trying so hard to be what she needs, but I don't know if I'm doing it right. She has nightmares every night. She won't let me out of her sight. And I don't know how to fix it, how to make her feel safe again. You can't fix it, Isadora said gently. You can only love her through it, and that's exactly what you're doing. I brought her today because she became hysterical when I tried to leave. The nursemaid couldn't calm her. She was screaming that I was going to die like Papa, that everyone she loved died, that she'd never see me again. By the time I got her calm enough to travel, we were already late, and I thought I should just bring her with me. Let you see the reality of what marrying me means, and if you rejected us, then at least I'd know before— He gestured helplessly. Before you allowed yourself to hope, Isadora finished. He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Tess stirred against Isadora's shoulder, her tear-streaked face turning toward her uncle. Uncle Leander, I'm here, darling. Lady Isadora promised she won't leave. She made a cross-my-heart promise. Leander's grey eyes met Isadora's over the golden curls. Did she? I did, Isadora confirmed. And I always keep my promises. Always. There was such hope in his voice, such desperate, fragile hope, that it made Isadora want to cry. Always, she repeated firmly. Your Grace, I think we need to have a serious conversation about this arrangement between our families. But first, I think we need to introduce Miss Tess properly to Princess Rainbow Feathers. Peacock introductions should not be delayed. For the first time since arriving, Leander smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his entire face, softening the harsh lines and making him almost devastatingly handsome. Of course, one mustn't keep Princess Rainbow Feathers waiting. They descended the terrace steps together, moving slowly to accommodate Tess's short legs. The child walked between them now, one hand in Isadora's, one hand in her uncle's, and some of the tension had left her small body. The peacocks were cooperating beautifully, the male spreading his tail in a magnificent display of iridescent blues and greens. Tess gasped with delight, all traces of tears momentarily forgotten. He's so pretty. Look at all the colors. That's because he's trying to impress the ladies, Leander explained, crouching down beside her. Male peacocks display their feathers to show how magnificent they are. Like gentlemen at balls wearing their finest coats? Tess asked, demonstrating a precociousness that made Isadora smile. Exactly like that. You're very clever to make that connection. Papa used to say I was clever like Mama. The tears threatened again, but Tess took a deep breath, clearly fighting them back. He said Mama could solve any puzzle and answer any question. Then you must take after her, Isadora said gently. And I think your Mama would be very proud of how brave you're being today. Meeting new people is difficult, especially when you're feeling sad. Tess considered this seriously. Are you really going to marry Uncle Leander? That's the plan, yes. And then you'll live with us at Northmere Castle? Yes. And you'll be there every day, not just visiting sometimes. Isadora knelt down, bringing herself to Tess's eye level. Every single day, when you wake up in the morning, I'll be there. When you have tea in the afternoon, I'll be there. When you go to bed at night, I'll be there. That's what being married means. We'll all be a family. A family, Tess repeated, testing the word. Then, so softly, Isadora almost missed it. Can I call you Mama? The question hit Isadora like a physical blow. She felt Leander go still beside her, and when she glanced at him, she saw shock and hope warring on his face. Would you like to call me Mama? Isadora asked carefully. Tess nodded, then immediately looked uncertain. Is that all right? I know you're not my real Mama, but my real Mama is in heaven with Papa, and Uncle Leander says it's all right to love people even when other people are in heaven, and I thought maybe— I would be honored, Isadora said, her voice thick with tears. So very honored, Tess. You can call me Mama, and I will do my very best to be a good Mama to you. Really. The hope in those blue eyes was almost painful to witness. Really and truly. Cross my heart. Isadora made the X gesture again. Tess threw her small arms around Isadora's neck with enough force to nearly topple her backward. Thank you, Mama. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Over the golden curls, Isadora's eyes met Leander's. His face was wet with tears he wasn't bothering to hide, and the look he gave her was so full of gratitude and wonder and something that might have been love that it took her breath away. "Thank you," he mouthed. Isadora just nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. The spoiled girl who'd sat in the drawing room rehearsing cutting remarks felt like a stranger, someone from another lifetime entirely. In her place was a woman who'd just discovered that the most important things in life often arrived wrapped in the most unexpected packages. The formal betrothal was announced in the Times 3 days later to considerable social interest. Lady Isadora Pelham, only daughter of the Marquess and Marchioness of Whitmore, to wed His Grace the Duke of Northmere. The wedding was set for September, 3 months away, to allow for proper preparations. 3 months that would change Isadora in ways she never could have anticipated. The morning after the announcement appeared, Isadora received a letter delivered by special courier. The handwriting was bold and masculine, and her heart gave an odd little flutter as she broke the Northmere seal. "Dear Lady Isadora, Tess has been asking for you constantly since we returned home. She woke 3 times last night from nightmares, and the only thing that calmed her was my promise that she would see you again soon. I realize it is highly irregular, and I apologize for the presumption, but would you and your mother consider visiting Northmere Castle? I know the proprieties suggest we should wait, but Tess's well-being must take precedence over social convention. If you could come even for a few days, I believe it would help her feel more secure about the upcoming changes in our household. Yours with great respect and gratitude, Northmere." Isadora read the letter 3 times, her heart squeezing painfully at the thought of Tess waking frightened in the night. She found her mother in the morning room, going over household accounts. "Mama, the Duke has written requesting that we visit Northmere Castle. He says Tess is having difficulty, nightmares and anxiety about my leaving." Her mother looked up, her expression thoughtful. "That poor child. Of course we'll go. When does he suggest?" "As soon as possible, I think. He doesn't say explicitly, but I can read between the lines." "Then we shall leave tomorrow. I'll send word immediately." The Marchioness set down her pen and studied her daughter with unusual intensity. "Isadora, are you certain about this? Taking on a traumatized child is no small thing. It will change your entire life." "I know," Isadora said quietly. "And yes, I'm certain. More certain than I've been about anything in my life." Her mother's expression softened. "You're changing, darling, growing into someone deeper than the girl you were a month ago. Is that a good thing?" "It's a wonderful thing, but change is never easy, even when it's for the better." They arrived at Northmere Castle 2 days later, in late afternoon when the sun painted the ancient stone walls gold and amber. The castle sat on a rise overlooking vast parkland that rolled toward distant hills in waves of green. It was magnificent in a way that made Pelham House look like a cottage in comparison. Towers and battlements dating back to the medieval period, formal gardens that must employ dozens of gardeners, a long drive lined with ancient oaks that had probably stood for centuries. "Heavens," breathed Isadora's mother as their carriage rolled up the drive. "I knew the Northmere estates were extensive, but this— Isadora, this is extraordinary." But Isadora was too busy scanning the windows, looking for a small figure with golden curls, to fully appreciate the grandeur. The Duke himself met them at the entrance, and Isadora was struck by how different he looked from their first meeting. He still wore formal black, still moved with that controlled grace, but there was a warmth in his grey eyes that hadn't been there before when they rested on her. "Lady Whitmore, Lady Isadora, thank you for coming on such short notice." He bowed over both their hands, and Isadora felt the brief press of his fingers against hers. Nothing improper, but enough to send warmth flooding through her. "I apologize for the irregular invitation, but Tess has been— that is, she's been quite insistent." "Where is she?" Isadora asked, dispensing with formality. A flicker of amusement crossed his stern features. "Supposedly having her afternoon rest. In reality, she's been watching from her nursery window for the past 2 hours, despite her nursemaid's best efforts to distract her. She's driven poor Mrs. Crawford to distraction." "Then we should go to her immediately," Isadora said firmly. "She must be frantic by now." "If you're not too fatigued from the journey." "Not at all, I'm quite eager to see her." Something in his expression softened further. "She'll be overjoyed. She hasn't talked about anything else since we returned home. Princess Rainbow Feathers has featured heavily in her bedtime stories." He led them through corridors lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors. generations of Vodukes staring down with varying degrees of aristocratic disapproval. They climbed a curving staircase with an intricately carved balustrade that must have been centuries old, passed through a gallery hung with paintings that Isadora was certain belonged in museums, and finally arrived at a door painted cheerful yellow, completely at odds with the medieval grandeur surrounding it. "I had her rooms redecorated," Leander explained, seeing Isadora's surprise. "When she came to live with me last autumn, shortly after Thomas's death, she was terrified by the dark wood paneling and heavy furniture that had been in the nursery for generations. This seemed friendlier, more suited to a child who'd lost everything familiar." The yellow door opened onto a suite of rooms that had clearly been designed with love. The nursery proper was bright and cheerful, with walls painted a soft cream and curtains patterned with flowers, framing tall windows that overlooked the gardens. Toys were arranged neatly on low shelves, dolls and blocks, and a beautiful rocking horse with a real horsehair mane. Books filled a small bookcase painted white. A child-sized table and chairs sat near the window, clearly meant for tea parties and drawing. And sitting on the window seat, her face pressed to the glass, her small hands leaving prints on the pane, was Tess. She spun around when the door opened, her face lighting up with such joy that it made Isadora's heart squeeze. "Mama!" The child flew across the room and launched herself at Isadora with enough force to nearly knock her over. Isadora caught her, laughing, and crouched down to return the fierce hug. "Hello, sweetheart. I've missed you." "I missed you more," Tess declared, her small arms wrapped around Isadora's neck in a stranglehold. "I missed you every single day, every single minute of every single day. I told Uncle Leander at breakfast and luncheon and tea and dinner, and even when I was supposed to be sleeping." "I'm not sure you told me every minute," Leander said dryly from the doorway. "There were at least 3 or 4 minutes during dinner last night when you were too busy eating syllabub to mention Lady Isadora." Tess giggled, a sound that transformed her solemn little face into something bright and beautiful. "Uncle Leander is being silly. He's silly lots of times. Last week he let me put ribbons in his hair during a tea party." Isadora looked at the Duke with new eyes, trying to imagine the stern, formal man with ribbons in his dark hair. The image made her want to laugh and cry simultaneously. "Did he? How many ribbons?" "7, Tess said proudly. "Pink ones. He looked very pretty." "I'm sure he did. I would very much like to see that sometime." "I'm afraid I destroyed the evidence," Leander replied, but his eyes held a warmth and humor that made Isadora's heart flutter strangely. "Some things are better left to memory and the imagination. Uncle Leander read me 3 bedtime stories last night, because I kept asking for more," Tess continued, her words tumbling over each other in her eagerness to share everything. "And he did all the voices. The gruff voice for the bear and the squeaky voice for the mouse and the scary voice for the wolf. And this morning we went riding and I got to sit in front of him on his big horse, and we saw a fox in the woods, and Cook made my favorite biscuits for tea and—" "Breathe, little one," Leander laughed. "You'll expire from lack of air if you continue at that pace." Isadora found herself smiling at the easy affection between them. The way Tess's entire being seemed to relax in her uncle's presence, the way his harsh features softened whenever he looked at her. This was a side of the Ice Duke that society never saw, the man who did silly voices and wore pink ribbons, and clearly would do absolutely anything to make a grieving child smile. Over the following days, Isadora discovered a world she'd never known existed. She accompanied Tess through her daily routines, morning lessons with the kind but firm governess Miss Thornbury, who was teaching her letters and simple sums, walks in the extensive gardens where they collected flowers and made elaborate bouquets, tea parties with dolls arranged around the small table in the nursery, where Isadora learned that Mr. Whiskers the cat, actually a threadbare stuffed toy, had very particular opinions about the proper way to serve imaginary tea. Story time in the library, where Leander would read while Tess sat on his lap and Isadora sat nearby, ostensibly working on embroidery, but actually watching the two of them with an ache in her chest that was equal parts joy and sorrow for all this child had lost. But there were also difficult moments when grief would overwhelm Tess without warning. She might be laughing one minute and sobbing the next, triggered by some random memory or association that the adults couldn't always identify. She would wake screaming from nightmares, and it was always Leander who went to her, who held her through the terror and the tears, who sat with her until she could sleep again. "How do you do it?" Isadora asked him one evening. They were in the library while Tess played quietly nearby with her dolls, acting out some elaborate drama that involved a princess and a dragon. Remain so patient, so kind, no matter how many times she wakes you, no matter how many tantrums or tears or difficult moments. Leander was quiet for a long moment, watching Tess with an expression that made Isadora's chest ache. "Because she's lost everything," he said finally. "Her mother died before she could even remember her. And her father, Thomas, was everything to her. He raised her alone, poured all his love and grief into being the best father he could be, and then he was taken from her too, in a way that she witnessed and couldn't prevent. How can I be anything but patient when she's dealing with more pain than any child should have to bear? Many men of your station would have hired nurses and governesses and never thought about it again," Isadora observed. "They would consider it beneath them to personally deal with a child's nightmares and tears." His jaw tightened. "Many men of my station didn't watch their younger brother die slowly while his daughter screamed for him. Didn't hold a 5-year-old who'd been sitting with her father's body for hours because she didn't understand he was gone." The rawness in his voice made Isadora catch her breath. "Thomas was my only sibling," Leander continued quietly, his eyes still on Tess. 6 years younger than I. Our mother died when he was just a boy, 8 years old. I was 14 and I practically raised him. When he married Caroline, I'd never seen him happier. He wrote me letters about how beautiful she was, how kind, how clever, how lucky he felt to have found such love. And when Tess was born, a slight smile touched his lips. He wrote me a 10-page letter describing every tiny finger and toe. He was absolutely besotted with her from the first moment. "What happened to Caroline?" Isadora asked softly. "Childbed fever. She died 3 days after Tess was born, never recovering from the delivery." His voice was flat now, emotionless in the way of someone reciting facts too painful to feel. "Thomas never recovered from losing her. Oh, he functioned. He raised his daughter with devoted attention, managed his own estates with competence, maintained his social obligations, but the light had gone out of him. He was going through the motions of living without actually being alive." He paused, his hand tightening on the arm of his chair. "And then, last November, he took a fall from his horse during a hunt. The doctor said it was simply an accident. The horse startled at a rabbit, Thomas was thrown and struck his head, but I've always wondered if he simply stopped fighting, if part of him wanted to be with Caroline, and so he didn't try hard enough to hold on." "Oh, Leander." Isadora's hand found his without conscious thought, her fingers weaving through his. His fingers closed around hers, strong and warm. Tess was there when he died. She was in his room, reading to him from a picture book about rabbits. She felt him go still, and kept reading for nearly an hour before she understood what had happened. The servants found her sitting there, still reading in her little voice, her father dead beside her. Tears streamed down Isadora's face. That poor baby. That poor, sweet baby. I got word the next day. A messenger rode through the night to tell me. I went immediately, took my fastest horse, and rode straight through, changing mounts at posting inns. When I arrived, she was empty, just staring at nothing, not speaking, not crying, not reacting to anything. It took weeks before she spoke again, months before she would sleep through the night without waking in terror. She's terrified of losing me, too. Some mornings I wake to find her sleeping on the floor beside my bed, because she needed to know I was still breathing. "You should have told us," Isadora said fiercely. "When you came to Pelham House, you should have explained everything." He turned to look at her fully, his grey eyes intense and searching. "Would you have been more forgiving of my tardiness? I would have been ashamed of my petty irritation and my rehearsed cutting remarks. I would have understood that you were dealing with something infinitely more important than social convention. I didn't want your pity, Isadora." The use of her given name sent warmth flooding through her. I needed to see if you could accept Tess. Accept that she comes first, that she will always come first, before you, before me, before society, before everything. I needed to know if you could love her the way she deserves to be loved, or if you would see her as an inconvenience to be managed by servants. The words should have rankled. A month ago, they would have infuriated her. This assumption that she should rank below a child, that her needs and wants came second to a little girl she'd never met. But watching Tess now, carefully arranging her dolls in what appeared to be a very serious conference, Isadora understood completely. I wouldn't want it any other way, she said softly. Tess deserves to come first. She's lost too much to be treated as anything less than the most important person in our lives. Something in Leander's expression shifted, a wall coming down, a door opening to let her in. His hand tightened around hers. You mean that? You truly mean that? I do. I didn't know I would. I didn't expect to feel this way, but I do. Mama, Uncle Leander! Tess came running over, her small face alight with excitement. Can we go see the horses, please? I want to show Mama my pony. His name is Butterscotch, and he's the most beautiful pony in the whole world, and I love him so much. Then we'd better go immediately, Isadora said, smiling. One mustn't keep the most beautiful pony in the world waiting. The stables at Northmere Castle were as impressive as everything else about the estate. A long building of mellow stone with neat boxes for dozens of horses, the smell of hay and leather and horse filling the warm air. The head groom, a grizzled man named Watkins, greeted them with a bow and a gap-toothed smile. Come to see young Butterscotch, have we, Lady Tess? Yes. And I want to show Mamma. She hasn't met him yet. Butterscotch proved to be a sturdy Welsh pony with a coat the colour of caramel and a remarkably patient temperament. He stood perfectly still while Tess chattered at him, stroking his neck and explaining in great detail all his various virtues. He's very gentle, Tess said seriously, and he doesn't mind when I cry. Sometimes when I'm sad I come here and talk to him, and he just listens and doesn't tell me to stop crying or that Papa wouldn't want me to be sad. He just lets me cry and eat apples with him. Isadora felt her throat tighten. He sounds like a very good friend. The best friend, except for Uncle Leander. And now you. Tess looked up at her with those enormous blue eyes. You're my friend too, aren't you, Mama? I'm better than a friend, Isadora said, crouching down to Tess's level. I'm your Mama, and Mamas love you even more than friends do. More than Butterscotch. Well, Butterscotch is pretty special, so maybe about the same amount as Butterscotch, but definitely more than Princess Rainbow Feathers. Tess giggled and threw her arms around Isadora's neck. Over the golden curls, Isadora's eyes met Leander's. He was leaning against Butterscotch's stall, watching them with an expression that made her heart race, tender and warm and full of something that looked very much like love. That evening, after Tess had been tucked into bed, after much protest and 3 extra stories, Leander invited Isadora to walk in the moonlit gardens. Her mother had retired early with a knowing smile, leaving them properly chaperoned by the presence of the house, but with enough privacy for conversation. They strolled in silence for several minutes, the only sound the crunch of gravel beneath their feet and the distant call of a nightingale. The formal gardens were beautiful in the moonlight, shadows and silver transforming the carefully maintained beds into something almost magical. She'll be heartbroken when you leave, Leander said finally, breaking the comfortable silence. I'll be heartbroken too, Isadora admitted, surprised by how true it was. I never thought I could love a child so quickly, so completely. It feels like she's been part of my heart forever. He stopped walking, turning to face her. In the moonlight his features were softer, more approachable, the harsh lines gentled by shadow. And what of her uncle? Isadora's heart hammered against her ribs. What of him? Could you love him too? Eventually. The vulnerability in his voice made her breath catch. I think, Isadora said carefully, that I already do. A little. Which is terrifying because a month ago I was prepared to deliver cutting remarks about punctuality and social convention, and now I'm making flower crowns and telling stories to dolls and feeling my heart break every time Tess cries. A smile curved his stern mouth, the first real smile she'd seen from him, the kind that transformed his entire face and made him almost devastatingly handsome. You've surprised me, Isadora. When I came to Pelham House that day, I expected rejection. I expected you to take one look at Tess, traumatized and clinging and sobbing, and decide that a ready-made family wasn't what you'd bargained for. I expected you to find some polite way to end the arrangement. Is that why you brought her? To test me? No. He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell sandalwood and leather, and something uniquely him. I brought her because she wouldn't let me leave without her. She was terrified I wouldn't come back, that I would die like her father and leave her alone. And I realized then that whoever I married needed to understand what they were taking on, needed to accept that Tess would always be part of our lives, that my devotion to her was absolute and non-negotiable. I thought it better to know immediately if you could accept that reality. And if I had failed your test. His hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb stroking gently across her skin in a caress that made her shiver despite the warm evening. Then I would have broken the betrothal and faced your father's wrath and probably made a scandal that would have followed me for years. But you didn't fail, Isadora. You exceeded every hope I had. You've been magnificent with her. The use of her given name, the tenderness in his voice, the gentle touch, all of it combined to make Isadora feel things she'd never expected to feel in an arranged marriage. I'm not the same person I was a month ago, she said softly. That girl seems like a stranger now, petty and shallow and concerned with all the wrong things. Neither am I, Leander said. You've reminded me that there's more to life than grief and duty and managing estates, that it's possible to feel hopeful again, to look forward to the future instead of just surviving each day. He leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away, to object, to remember all the rules about propriety and proper courtship. But Isadora found herself rising on her toes to meet him halfway, her hands coming up to rest against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palms. The kiss was gentle, almost reverent, a question and an answer all at once. His lips were warm and soft against hers, moving with tender care as though she were something precious and breakable. One of his hands cradled her face while the other settled at the small of her back, pulling her closer but not too close, maintaining propriety even as they crossed into something deeper than a formal arrangement. When they parted, both were breathing unevenly, and Isadora felt as though the world had shifted on its axis. September feels very far away, Leander murmured against her hair, his arms still around her. Isadora laughed softly, the sound breathless. We'll visit again, as often as propriety allows. I won't go 3 months without seeing Tess, or you. What about without seeing me? There was teasing in his voice, but also genuine vulnerability, as though he needed to hear her say it. She pulled back just enough to look at him, seeing past the Ice Duke facade to the man beneath, a man who'd been forced to freeze his heart to survive loss and was now tentatively learning to thaw. Without seeing you either, she admitted, though I'm not entirely sure when that became as important as seeing Tess. His smile was brighter this time, reaching his eyes and transforming his whole face. I love you, Isadora. I didn't expect to. I thought this would be a practical arrangement, nothing more than a convenient alliance between our families. But you've burrowed into my heart when I wasn't looking, and I find I don't want you to leave. I love you too, she whispered, the words feeling both terrifying and absolutely right. Heaven help me, I love you both, you and Tess. You've become my whole heart in less than a month. He kissed her again, deeper this time, with more certainty and less restraint. And Isadora felt the last remnants of her old self fall away like a discarded cloak. The spoiled girl who'd cared only for gowns and social standing and cutting remarks was gone completely. In her place was a woman who'd discovered something far more valuable than any title or fortune or social triumph. She'd discovered a family worth fighting for. August brought thunderstorms to the English countryside, great towering clouds that rolled across the sky and released torrents of rain that turned the roads to mud and the rivers to rushing torrents. Isadora stood at her bedroom window in Pelham House, watching lightning split the dark sky with jagged brilliance, and thought of Tess. The child was terrified of storms. Mrs. Crawford, the nursemaid, had mentioned it during Isadora's last visit to Northmere. Something about the way her father had died during a storm, the rain beating against the windows, while Tess sat reading to his still form, not understanding that he was gone. Was someone holding her now? Was Leander there? Or was he away on estate business, as he so often had to be? Was Tess huddled under her covers, crying for her father, for her mother, for all the safety that had been stolen from her young life? The thought made Isadora restless. She paced her room, unable to settle, jumping at each crack of thunder. She'd seen them only twice since that moonlit kiss in the Northmere Gardens, brief chaperoned visits that left everyone frustrated. Tess had clung to her at each parting, tears streaming down her small face, begging Isadora not to go. And Leander's eyes had held such longing, such barely restrained emotion, that it physically hurt to leave him. September can't come soon enough, Isadora muttered to the storm, pressing her forehead against the cool glass. A sharp knock at her door made her jump. Agnes entered, without waiting for permission, looking genuinely concerned, despite her usual composure. My lady, There's a messenger downstairs, from Northmere Castle. He's ridden through the storm, absolutely drenched. Your father requests your presence in the library immediately." Isadora's heart stuttered, then began to race. A messenger, in the middle of a storm, in the middle of the night. Something was wrong, something was terribly wrong. She flew down the stairs, not bothering with a wrap over her nightgown, not caring that her hair was loose and unpinned, not thinking about anything except Tess and Leander, and what could possibly have happened to send a messenger riding through such weather. Her father stood by the library fire, reading a letter by candlelight, his face grave with concern. He looked up when she burst through the door, and his expression softened slightly at her obvious distress. "Papa, what's happened? Is it Tess? Is she hurt?" "No, darling. Nothing so dire." He held out the letter. "The Duke writes that Tess has taken ill. A fever and cough. The physician has examined her and says it's nothing too serious, likely just a summer cold, but she's become quite hysterical, convinced she's dying like her father did. She's asking for you." Leander apologizes profusely for the presumptuousness of the request, but he wonders if you might come. Isadora was already moving toward the door. "I'll leave immediately." "Isadora, it's the middle of the night. In a storm that's turning the roads into rivers." "I don't care, that little girl needs me." Her mother appeared in the doorway, wrapping a dressing gown around herself, her hair in a long plait down her back. She must have heard the commotion. "Then we'll go together at first light," she said firmly. "But not before, dear. The roads are treacherous. I can hear the rain from here, and you won't help Tess if you're thrown from a carriage or struck by a falling branch. We'll leave the moment it's light enough to travel safely." It was the longest night of Isadora's life. She paced her room, watching the storm rage through her window, imagining Tess frightened and ill and crying for her. She thought of how small the child was, how fragile, how much loss she'd already endured. The thought of her believing she was dying, terrified and alone, made Isadora want to scream. Finally, as grey dawn broke through the dissipating storm clouds, she heard the sounds of the carriage being prepared. She was dressed and ready before the servants had finished hitching the horses, her travelling case packed by a bleary-eyed Agnes, who'd clearly gotten as little sleep as her mistress. The journey to Northmere seemed to take forever. The roads were indeed treacherous, muddy and rutted, forcing the driver to go slower than Isadora would have liked. But finally, they rolled up the long drive to see the castle rising against the clearing sky. Leander met them at the door before they'd even fully alighted from the carriage. He looked haggard, his dark hair dishevelled as though he'd been running his hands through it repeatedly, his grey eyes shadowed with sleeplessness. "Thank heaven you've come," he said, gripping Isadora's hands with an intensity that was probably improper, but which neither of them cared about. "She's been crying for you all night. The physician says there's nothing physically wrong beyond a mild fever and cough, probably from getting caught in yesterday's rain during our walk in the garden, but she's convinced herself she's dying like Thomas did. Nothing I say can calm her." "Take me to her," Isadora said simply. He led them through the castle at almost a run, taking the stairs two at a time while Isadora lifted her skirts to keep pace. Her mother followed at a more sedate pace, but Isadora couldn't wait. The nursery was dim when they entered, curtains drawn against the weak morning light. Tess lay in her small bed, her face flushed with fever, her golden curls damp with sweat and tears. Mrs. Crawford sat beside her, bathing her forehead with cool cloths, but even from the doorway Isadora could hear the child's laboured breathing and quiet sobs. "Tess, darling," Leander said softly, moving to the bedside. "Look who's come to see you." The blue eyes, so like her mother's Isadora now knew from the portrait Leander had shown her, opened slowly, struggling to focus. "Mama," the word was barely a whisper, hoarse and broken. "I'm here, sweetheart." Isadora was at the bedside in an instant, taking the small hot hand in both of hers. "I came as soon as I heard you were poorly." "I'm dying," Tess whispered, fresh tears leaking from the corners of her fever-bright eyes. "Like Papa. I'm going to die and leave Uncle Leander all alone, and you won't be my Mama anymore because I'll be dead like Papa and Mama Caroline." "No, darling. No, you're not dying." Isadora smoothed back the damp curls with her free hand, her heart breaking at the terror in the child's eyes. "You have a fever and a cough, that's all. Do you remember when you told me about having a fever last winter? How Uncle Leander sat with you and told you stories until you felt better?" A small, uncertain nod. "This is just like that. You'll feel wretched for a day or two, hot and achy and tired, and then you'll start to improve, and then you'll be completely well again. I promise you, sweetheart. But Papa said he was getting better, Tess sobbed, her small body shaking with the force of her distress. The doctor said he was getting better, but then he wasn't better. He was worse. He was dying. And I was reading to him, and he just stopped. He stopped breathing, and his hand went cold, and I kept reading because maybe if I read enough, he would wake up again, but he didn't. He didn't wake up. Leander made a choked sound and turned away, his shoulders rigid with suppressed emotion. Isadora saw his hands clench into fists at his sides. Your papa was very, very ill, sweetheart, Isadora said, gathering the feverish child as close as she dared. His injuries from the fall were serious, much worse than a fever and cough. But you're going to be fine, I promise you. Look at me. She waited until Tess's swimming eyes focused on her face. I am making you a solemn promise right now. You are not going to die. You're going to get better, and soon you'll be running around the gardens again and riding butterscotch and having tea parties with your dolls. Promise? The word was so small, so desperate. I promise. Cross my heart. Isadora made the X gesture over her chest, their special sign for the most important promises. Will you stay? Tess's hot little hand gripped Isadora's with surprising strength. Please. I'm so scared, please don't leave me. I'll stay as long as you need me, as long as you want me to stay. Forever? Isadora's eyes met Leander's over the golden curls. His face was raw with emotion, gratitude and love and desperate hope all mingled together. Forever, Isadora promised. Even after we're married and I live here all the time, I'll still stay with you when you're ill. That's what mothers do. Tess's breathing was still rapid and shallow, but some of the panic had left her eyes. You're really my mama now? If you'd like me to be. I could never replace your real mama. Caroline will always be your mother in heaven, but I can try to love you the way she would have if she were still here. And you won't die. The question broke Isadora's heart. Not for a very, very long time. Long enough to see you grow up and have children of your own. Long enough to be a grandmother to your babies. That's a very long time, Tess said, her eyes already starting to droop with exhaustion. Yes, it is. And I will be here for all of it. Tess's grip on her hand loosened slightly, as fever and emotional exhaustion pulled her towards sleep. Love you, Mama, she mumbled. I love you too, sweetheart. So very much. Within minutes, Tess had fallen asleep. The first peaceful sleep she'd had in hours, according to Mrs. Crawford. Isadora held her, stroking the damp curls, feeling something shift and settle inside her chest. This wasn't just affection anymore. This wasn't just growing fondness or maternal instinct. This was bone-deep, fierce, protective love, the kind that would walk through fire for this child, the kind that would fight dragons and move mountains, and do absolutely anything to keep her safe. Let me take her, Leander said softly. You must be exhausted from the journey. I'm fine, Isadora whispered back. I told her I'd stay. Then I'll stay with you. He pulled up a chair beside the bed, settling into it as though preparing for a long vigil. For the next several hours they kept watch together. Mrs. Crawford brought tea and a light breakfast, which they consumed with one hand while keeping the other on the sleeping child. Isadora's mother looked in periodically, her eyes suspiciously bright, but she said nothing beyond asking if they needed anything. By afternoon, the fever had broken. Tess woke looking weak but clearer-eyed, the panic gone from her face, replaced by hunger and a child's amazing resilience. I'm hungry, she announced, her voice hoarse but much stronger than it had been that morning. Leander laughed, a sound of pure relief that made his whole face transform. Then we shall have cook send up an absolute feast. What would you like, darling? Everything. Toast with butter and honey, tea with lots of sugar, those jam tarts I like, and pudding. Definitely pudding. A woman after my own heart, Isadora said, smiling. Pudding is always the right answer. They spent the rest of the day in the nursery, playing quiet games suited to a recovering invalid, reading stories, and watching Tess regain her strength by visible degrees. By evening she was sitting up demanding second helpings of syllabub and chattering about all the things they would do once she was completely well. Can we have a picnic? With sandwiches and lemonade and those little cakes with icing? Absolutely, Isadora agreed. And can we visit Butterscotch? I want to give him an apple and tell him I'm not dying. Of course. And can we... Tess yawned enormously, her small face scrunching up. Can we... Sleep now, Leander said gently, carefully lifting her to tuck her more comfortably under the covers. All the planning can wait until tomorrow, when you're even stronger. But when they tried to leave, Tess's hand shot out, gripping Isadora's with surprising strength for someone so recently ill. Don't go, please don't go. I'm just going to have dinner with your uncle and my mother, sweetheart. I'll come back and check on you before you go to sleep for the night. I promise. Cross your heart. Cross my heart. Isadora made the gesture, then leaned down to kiss the child's warm forehead. It was much cooler than it had been that morning, but still slightly elevated. And I'll be right down the hall in one of the guest rooms, so if you need me in the night, Mrs. Crawford can fetch me immediately. This seemed to satisfy her. Tess settled back against her pillows, her eyes already drooping. Love you, Mama. I love you too, my darling girl. Downstairs, over a late dinner with her mother and Leander, Isadora found herself fighting tears of exhaustion and emotion. The fear of the night and morning, the relief of seeing Tess improve, the weight of that small body trusting her completely, all of it combined to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. You were magnificent today, Leander said quietly, his hand finding hers beneath the table in a gesture that was becoming comfortably familiar. The way you calmed her, the promises you made, the way you stayed with her for hours without complaint. Isadora, I can never thank you enough. You don't need to thank me for loving her. How could I not love her? She's wonderful and brave and resilient, and she deserves all the love we can possibly give her. Many women wouldn't feel that way, her mother observed, setting down her teacup. Many women of our class would see a traumatized child as an inconvenience, a complication to an otherwise advantageous match. They would expect nurses and governesses to handle such difficulties while they maintained their social calendars and pleasures. Then those women are fools, Isadora said fiercely, and they don't deserve to be mothers. Something in Leander's expression cracked open, revealing depths of emotion that made Isadora's breath catch. I asked you once if you could love me, he said hoarsely. But perhaps I should have asked a different question first. What question? He set down his fork and turned to face her fully, his grey eyes intense and unwavering. Would you be willing to become Tess's mother in truth? Not just in name after we marry, but formally, legally? I could petition for you to adopt her once we're wed. She would be Lady Tess Pelham Vaux, daughter to both of us in the eyes of the law and society. Isadora's breath caught. She hadn't expected this, hadn't dared to hope for it. You would do that? In a heartbeat. She already calls you Mama. She already loves you as a mother. Why shouldn't it be official? Why shouldn't she have the security of knowing that you're bound to her legally as well as emotionally? She thought of the promises she'd made to a frightened child that morning. Forever. That's what mothers do. Yes, she whispered, her voice thick with tears. Yes, I want that more than anything. I want her to be mine, ours, in every possible way. The smile that broke across Leander's face was like sunrise after a long night. He pulled her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles with a tenderness that made her heart ache. Then let's not wait until September. Let's not wait another 3 months when we could be a family now, her mother gasped. Leander, that's highly irregular. The banns, the preparations, the guests. Hang the banns and the preparations and the guests, he said, his eyes never leaving Isadora's. I don't care about a grand society wedding. I care about my family, about starting our life together immediately, about giving Tess the security of knowing we're all bound together legally and irrevocably before anything else can go wrong. Your father will have apoplexy, Isadora's mother warned. He's been planning this wedding for months. The guest list alone has over 300 names. But Isadora was already nodding, tears streaming down her face, her heart so full she thought it might burst. Yes, yes, let's not wait. Let's get a special license and marry as soon as we can arrange it, this week if possible. This week, her mother looked faint. Isadora, that's impossible. Your dress isn't finished, the flowers aren't ordered, I don't need an elaborate dress or a cathedral full of flowers, Mama. I just need Leander and Tess and the vicar saying the words that make us a family. But society can think what it likes, Isadora said firmly. I don't care. And she realized with a clarity that was almost startling that she truly didn't. The girl who would have died of shame at an irregular wedding, who would have insisted on every social nicety and tradition, was gone. In her place was a woman who knew what really mattered, And what mattered was the man sitting beside her, looking at her as though she'd just given him the world. And the child upstairs, sleeping peacefully because she believed in Isadora's promises. Everything else was just noise. They were married 5 days later, in the small chapel at Northmere Castle, on a warm August afternoon when the sun painted everything gold. There were no grand preparations, no society guests filling the pews, no elaborate gown that had taken months to create. Just immediate family, Isadora's parents looking slightly scandalized but ultimately approving, Leander's elderly aunt who'd travelled from Scotland, a handful of close servants who'd been with the Vogt family for generations, and one very excited 5-year-old in a white dress, holding a bouquet of summer flowers she'd helped collect from the gardens that morning. Isadora wore a simple ivory silk dress that her mother had worn for her own wedding, hastily altered to fit by a talented local seamstress working round the clock. Her dark hair was dressed with flowers rather than an elaborate veil. She carried roses from the Northmere gardens. But when she walked down the aisle of the ancient chapel and saw Leander waiting for her, saw the way his face transformed with love and hope and joy, she felt more beautiful than she ever had in her life. And when Tess rushed forward to take her hand, insisting on standing between them during the ceremony, Isadora felt her heart swell until she thought it might actually burst from happiness. "Dearly beloved," the elderly vicar began, his voice echoing off the ancient stones, "we are gathered here today." Isadora barely heard the words. She was too busy looking at Leander, at the way he smiled down at Tess, who stood between them, one small hand in each of theirs, at the way his grey eyes kept finding hers, full of promises and forever. "Do you, Leander Edward Vaux, Duke of Northmere, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do." His voice was strong and clear and absolutely certain. "And do you, Isadora Catherine Pelham, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do." She barely recognized her own voice, so thick with emotion. "Then by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." Leander leaned in, carefully, because Tess was still between them, and kissed her gently. It was chaste and brief, appropriate for a chapel and an audience, but Isadora felt it all the way to her toes. When they pulled apart, Tess cheered so loudly it echoed off the stone walls like a cannonade. "Now you're really my mama. Now it's official and forever and always." Isadora crouched down, not caring what it did to her borrowed silk dress, and pulled the child into a fierce hug. "Now it's official and forever and always," she agreed. "You're stuck with me, sweetheart." "Good. I want to be stuck with you. Forever and ever and ever." When Isadora stood wiping tears from her eyes, she found Leander watching them with such love that it stole her breath. He held out his hand, and when she took it, he raised it to his lips. "Thank you," he said softly for her ears alone. "Thank you for choosing us, for seeing past the Ice Duke to the man beneath, for loving Tess as your own. Thank you for being brave enough to build a family with us." "I should be thanking you," Isadora replied. "You showed me what really matters. What's worth fighting for? Before I met you and Tess, I was just drifting through life caring about all the wrong things. You both saved me." They emerged from the chapel into golden afternoon sunshine. The castle servants had lined up to cheer, and Isadora found herself laughing as rice was thrown and good wishes called out. Tess danced ahead of them, scattering flower petals and spinning in circles, her earlier illness completely forgotten in the excitement of the day. The wedding breakfast was intimate, just their small party in the family dining room rather than the grand hall. Cook had outdone herself despite the short notice, producing an elaborate meal that had Tess squealing with delight at each new course. "Can we save some of the cake for Butterscotch?" she asked seriously. "He should have wedding cake too since he's part of the family." "Butterscotch is a pony," Leander pointed out, but he was smiling. "I'm not sure ponies eat wedding cake." "Then we'll give him extra apples instead. Special wedding apples." "Special wedding apples it is." That night, after Tess had been put to bed, after much excited chatter about now having a real mama and father both, Isadora stood in what was now her room, the Duchess's chamber that connected to Leander's through a shared sitting room. It was beautiful, decorated in soft blues and creams, but she barely saw it. She was married. She was the Duchess of Northmere, and more importantly, she was Tess's mother and Leander's wife, which mattered infinitely more than any title. A soft knock made her turn. Leander stood in the doorway of the connecting sitting room, still in his formal clothes, though he'd removed his cravat. His dark hair was slightly dishevelled where he'd been running his hands through it. A habit she'd learned meant he was nervous or emotional or both. "May I come in?" "This is your home," Isadora pointed out, but she was smiling. "Of course you may come in." He closed the distance between them, taking her hands in his. "How are you feeling? No regrets about the hasty wedding?" "Not a single one, you?" "Only that I didn't do this sooner." He pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her waist. "I love you, Isadora Vaux. I love your kindness with Tess, your fierce protectiveness, the way you've transformed from that irritated girl in the drawing room to the woman standing before me. I love that you put our daughter first, that you rode through a storm to get to her, that you held her through her fever without complaint." "Our daughter," Isadora repeated, testing the words. "I like the sound of that." "So do I." He kissed her then, properly this time, without Tess between them or propriety dictating restraint. It was deep and thorough and full of promise, his hands moving to frame her face while hers fisted in his coat. When they finally parted, both were breathing hard. "I should let you rest," Leander said reluctantly. "It's been a long day." But Isadora shook her head, her hands tightening on his coat to keep him close. "Stay, please. I don't want to be apart from you tonight." His eyes darkened with emotion that wasn't entirely pure. "Are you certain?" "Absolutely certain. We're married now, and I want to be your wife in every sense." What followed was tender and sweet and occasionally awkward in the way of first times, but perfect in its imperfection. Leander was gentle and patient, taking his time despite his obvious desire, making sure she was comfortable and willing at every step. And Isadora discovered that the ice they said surrounded the Duke was entirely absent in his private chambers, replaced by fire and passion, and a devotion that made her feel cherished beyond measure. Afterward, lying in the tangle of sheets with her head on his chest and his arms around her, Isadora felt a contentment she'd never known existed. "No regrets?" Leander asked softly, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her shoulder. "Not a single one." "You?" "Only that we didn't do this months ago." She laughed, the sound muffled against his chest. "We didn't know each other months ago. A minor detail. They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, and for the first time in months, Leander slept through the night without waking to check on Tess, secure in the knowledge that if she needed them, they were both there now. The summer gave way to autumn, and autumn to winter. Life at Northmere Castle settled into a comfortable rhythm that Isadora had never imagined she'd find satisfying, but which filled her with quiet joy. Tess thrived under the security of having both a mother and father. The nightmares became less frequent and then stopped almost entirely. She began to smile and laugh more freely, to play with the abandon natural to a child her age. She started proper lessons with Miss Thornbury, proving herself to be as clever as her late mother had supposedly been, picking up reading and mathematics with impressive speed. And she called Isadora Mama, with such natural affection that most people forgot she hadn't been born to the title. The adoption papers were finalized in October, making it official in law as well as in heart. Lady Tess Pelham Vaux, daughter of the Duke and Duchess of Northmere. Tess had insisted on keeping Vaux in her name. "Because Papa was a Vaux and I want to remember him always," and Isadora had agreed immediately. Thomas deserved to be remembered, to be part of his daughter's identity even in death. For Isadora and Leander, the marriage that had begun as a convenience and transformed into love deepened with each passing day. They learned each other's rhythms and habits, discovered shared interests they hadn't expected. A love of early morning rides through the estate, enjoyment of reading aloud to each other in the evenings, a surprising mutual appreciation for terrible puns that made Tess groan dramatically. And in January, on a cold morning when frost painted the windows in delicate patterns, Isadora woke feeling decidedly unwell. She barely made it to the basin before losing the contents of her stomach. Leander was beside her immediately, holding back her hair, his face creased with concern. "Should I send for the physician?" "No," Isadora managed when the nausea passed. "No, I think I know what this is." He went very still. "You think? I'm late. 3 weeks late. And this nausea, the way I've been so tired lately, how emotional I've been." She looked up at him, saw understanding dawn on his face. "I think we're going to have a baby." The smile that broke across his face was incandescent. He pulled her carefully into his arms, mindful of her delicate stomach. A baby. We're going to have a baby. Are you pleased? Suddenly, Isadora felt uncertain. They hadn't discussed this, hadn't planned for it yet. I know it's soon, and with Tess still adjusting. Pleased? He pulled back to look at her, his grey eyes bright with tears. Isadora, I'm overjoyed. Tess will have a sibling. You're giving our family another member to love. How could I be anything but pleased? The physician confirmed it later that week. The Duchess of Northmere was indeed with child, due to arrive in late summer. Tess was beside herself with excitement when they told her. A baby? A real baby? That I can teach things to and play with and show all my favorite toys. Exactly, Isadora confirmed, laughing at the child's enthusiasm. Though it will be quite a while before the baby is big enough to play properly. Newborns mostly just eat and sleep. That's all right, I'll wait, and I'll help take care of it. I'll be the best big sister in the whole world. I know you will, sweetheart. As winter gave way to spring and spring to summer, Isadora's body changed in ways both wonderful and uncomfortable. Leander was attentive to the point of being excessive, insisting she rest constantly, forbidding her from riding or any activity he deemed too strenuous. It would have been annoying if it hadn't been so obviously motivated by love. Tess, now 6 years old, appointed herself Isadora's personal guardian, fetching cushions and ensuring she drank enough water and reading to her when she was too tired to hold a book herself. And in August, on a warm afternoon exactly 1 year after their hasty wedding, Isadora gave birth to a healthy son. They named him Thomas for Leander's brother and Tess's father, with the middle name of William for Isadora's father. Thomas William Vaux, future Duke of Northmere. Tess was the first person besides Leander that Isadora wanted to see after the delivery. She'd been waiting outside the birthing room with her grandmother, and the moment she was allowed in, she scrambled onto the bed with only slightly more care than usual. Let me see, she demanded, then immediately gentled her voice. May I see, please? Isadora adjusted the blankets to reveal the baby's small face, red and wrinkled, but absolutely perfect. This is your brother, Tess. Thomas. Say hello. Hello, Thomas, Tess whispered, her voice full of awe. I'm your big sister. I'm going to teach you everything, how to read and ride ponies and catch butterflies and name peacocks. And I'll never let anyone be mean to you. That's what big sisters do. Would you like to hold him? With Mama's help. Tess nodded eagerly, and together they arranged the baby in her arms, supporting his head carefully. Isadora watched her daughter, because that's what Tess was in every way that mattered, gazed down at her brother with such tender devotion that it brought tears to her eyes. He's so small, Tess breathed. Was I this small once? Even smaller, Leander confirmed from his position beside the bed. He'd been there for the entire delivery, refusing to leave despite custom suggesting he should wait elsewhere. You were tiny. You fit in my 2 hands. I'm going to be the best big sister, Tess declared with absolute confidence. Better than Princess Rainbow Feathers would be, even. That's setting a very high bar, Isadora said, smiling through her exhaustion. I know, but I can do it. And over the following weeks she did exactly that. Tess was devoted to her new brother, with a fierceness that reminded Isadora of Leander's devotion to her. She wanted to help with everything, changing nappies, though she wrinkled her nose at the smell, fetching blankets, singing songs. When Thomas cried, she would run to Isadora's room to alert her, as though Isadora might not have heard the wailing that echoed through half the castle. You've created a monster, Leander observed one evening, watching Tess carefully rock the cradle while singing a lullaby slightly off-key. She's going to be insufferable when he's old enough to play properly. I think it's sweet, Isadora said, leaning against her husband's shoulder. They were in the nursery, recently expanded to accommodate both children, watching their daughter care for their son with touching dedication. It is sweet, Leander agreed. She's come so far from that terrified little girl who clung to me in your drawing room. We all have, Isadora observed. I'm certainly not the person I was that day. No, you're better, kinder, more patient. More beautiful, though I didn't think that was possible. She turned to look at him, seeing the love and contentment in his face. The Ice Duke was a distant memory, replaced entirely by this warm, affectionate man who did silly voices during bedtime stories and let Tess put ribbons in his hair and held her, while she cried over the father she'd lost. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd been on time that day? Isadora asked. If you'd come without Tess, if we'd had that formal first meeting as planned. Leander considered this seriously. I think I would have liked you. You're intelligent and beautiful and well-bred. I probably would have gone through with the marriage because it was advantageous and expected, but I don't think I would have loved you. Not the way I love you now, because the woman I love is the one who knelt down in an expensive silk dress to comfort a crying child. The one who rode through a storm because Tess needed her. The one who promised forever and meant it. And I wouldn't have loved you either, Isadora admitted. I would have seen the Ice Duke everyone warned me about and never looked deeper. I would have married you for your title and your wealth and probably been miserable. Instead, you married me for my charming daughter and questionable punctuality. She laughed, the sound soft in the quiet nursery. Exactly. Much better qualifications. Thomas chose that moment to wake with a wail that made Tess jump. He's hungry again, Mama. Then I suppose I'd better feed him, Isadora said, rising with a grace that was returning now that her body was recovering from childbirth. Later that night, after both children were asleep, Tess in her own room decorated in yellows and whites, and Thomas in the cradle beside Isadora and Leander's bed, Isadora stood at the window looking out over the Northmere estates bathed in moonlight. Leander came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. What are you thinking about? How much everything has changed. A year ago, I was Lady Isadora Pelham, spoiled and petty, and concerned with all the wrong things. Now I'm the Duchess of Northmere, mother to 2 children, wife to a man I love more than I thought possible. Sometimes I can barely remember who I used to be. I'm glad you've forgotten her, Leander said. I much prefer who you've become. So do I, Isadora admitted. She was rather insufferable, wasn't she? A bit. But she had potential. She just needed the right motivation to become her best self. The right motivation being a chronically late duke and a traumatized 5-year-old? Exactly. Isadora turned in his arms to face him. Thank you. For what? For being late, for bringing Tess, for seeing past the spoiled girl to the woman I could become, for loving me even when I didn't deserve it. You always deserved it, Leander said firmly. From the moment you knelt down to comfort Tess, you deserved everything good I could possibly give you. He kissed her then, sweet and lingering, and Isadora felt the last piece of her old life fall away completely. The girl who'd sat in the Pelham House drawing room, rehearsing cutting remarks, was gone forever. In her place was a woman who'd learned that the best things in life came wrapped in unexpected packages. That love could transform even the most unlikely hearts. That family wasn't about blood, but about choice and devotion and promises kept. That being late for a first meeting, when it brought you the people who would change your life forever, was actually perfect timing. 5 years later, 1860. The drawing room at Northmere Castle was in joyful chaos. 10-year-old Tess sat at the piano, attempting to teach 6-year-old Thomas a simple melody, while their efforts were enthusiastically hindered by 4-year-old Caroline, named for the grandmother she'd never meet, who insisted on helping by banging on the lower keys. And crawling determinedly toward the piano stool, clearly intent on joining his siblings, was 1-year-old Edward, the surprise baby who'd arrived 9 months after Isadora and Leander thought they were quite finished having children. I do believe, Leander observed from his position by the window, watching the musical disaster unfold with obvious amusement, that we've created a small army. Your army, Isadora pointed out, looking up from the letter she was writing. You're the one who keeps looking at me with those grey eyes and, Mama, Tess called over the cacophony. Tell Thomas he's doing it wrong. I'm not doing it wrong, Thomas protested, his voice indignant. You're just being bossy like always. I'm not bossy, I'm helpful. Bossy, Caroline contributed cheerfully, banging harder on her keys for emphasis. Bossy, bossy, bossy. This from Edward, who had apparently learned a new word. Isadora caught Leander's eye, and they both burst out laughing. The kind of deep, genuine laughter that came from being completely overwhelmed and entirely content simultaneously. Do you ever wonder what our life would have been like if things had gone differently? Isadora asked once they'd recovered. If you'd been on time that day? If we'd had that proper formal courtship everyone expected? Leander crossed the room to sit beside her on the settee, automatically pulling Edward into his lap when the baby crawled over to investigate. I try not to think about it. That life, the one where I was punctual and proper and married the ice duke everyone expected, seems cold and empty compared to this." He gestured to their children. Tess had abandoned the piano lesson in favor of building a tower with blocks, while Thomas helped by knocking it down, sending Caroline into peals of giggles. "This is messy and loud, and nothing at all like what I imagined my life would be, and I wouldn't change a single thing. Not even when Edward decided to redecorate the library with jam last week. Not even then, though I'll admit the sticky books were challenging." Tess looked up from her blocks, catching the adult conversation with the preternatural awareness of a 10-year-old. "Tell us again about the day you and Mama met," she demanded. "When Uncle Leander, Papa, was late and brought me along, and Mama made up silly names for the peacocks." It had become one of her favorite stories, this tale of their beginning. She never seemed to tire of hearing how scared she'd been, how kind Isadora had been, how love had transformed them all. "Well," Isadora began, setting aside her letter, "your father was very, very late." "Because I was having a panic about being left alone," Tess interjected, as she always did. "Exactly. And I was sitting in the drawing room at Pelham House, absolutely furious, rehearsing all the cutting things I was going to say about punctuality and respect. But then you saw me and you forgot to be angry," Tess said, beaming. "I did, because you needed kindness more than I needed to prove a point." Isadora smiled at the memory. That terrified little girl clinging to Leander's coat, those enormous blue eyes swimming with tears. "And we went to the garden and named the peacocks ridiculous names." "Lord Featherbottom," Thomas shouted gleefully. He'd heard this story dozens of times and knew all the best parts. "And Princess Rainbow Feathers," Caroline added, not wanting to be left out. "And then Mama promised she'd never leave me," Tess said, her voice going soft the way it always did at this part. "And she kept her promise. She always keeps her promises." "Always," Isadora confirmed, meeting her daughter's eyes across the room. "I promised you forever, and that's exactly what you got." "Do you wish Papa had been on time?" Thomas asked seriously. He was a thoughtful child, given to philosophical questions that often surprised the adults around him. "If he'd been on time, you might have married someone else. Then Tess wouldn't be our sister and we wouldn't exist." "That," Leander said firmly, "is an absolutely horrifying thought. No, Thomas, I do not wish I'd been on time. Being late for that meeting was the best decision I never made." "You didn't decide to be late," Tess pointed out with childish logic. "You were late because of me." "Then you made the best decision I never made," Leander amended, pulling his eldest daughter into a one-armed hug while balancing Edward with the other. "You insisted on coming with me, and that changed everything for the better." "I'm very wise," Tess said with complete seriousness. "Insufferably so," Leander agreed, but his eyes were soft with love. That evening, after all 4 children had been tucked into bed, after the usual negotiations about one more story, one more glass of water, one more good-night kiss, Isadora and Leander stood in the doorway of the old nursery, looking at the space that had been Tess's alone when she first came to Northmere. "Do you remember the first time I came here?" Isadora asked softly. "How Tess had been watching from the window for hours, how she flew across the room to hug me. I remember thinking my heart might actually burst from hope and fear in equal measure," Leander admitted. "Hope that you might actually accept us, fear that you'd realize what a complicated situation you were marrying into, and run for the hills." "I did realize it," Isadora said. "I just didn't care. Or rather, I cared about the right things, about a little girl who needed love, about a man who was trying so hard to be enough for her." "We're quite a far cry from the people we were," Leander observed. "The Ice Duke and the spoiled Marchioness's daughter." "Good riddance to both of them," Isadora said firmly. "I much prefer the man who does silly voices at bedtime and lets his daughter put ribbons in his hair. And I prefer the woman who rides through storms to comfort a sick child and doesn't mind when jam ends up on rare books." They made their way to their own chambers, the rooms they'd shared for 6 years now, comfortable and familiar and full of memories. Isadora's dressing table held a miniature portrait of all 4 children painted just last month. Leander's desk was covered with papers relating to estate management and parliamentary matters, but also with drawings from the children, crude stick figures that he refused to throw away. "Do you ever wonder if we'll have more?" Leander asked as they prepared for bed, following the comfortable routine of 6 years of marriage. Isadora paused in brushing her hair. "More children?" "Leander, we have 4. Edward is barely a year old. I think we're quite finished." That's what we said after Caroline. And I meant it then too. Edward was definitely a surprise. A wonderful surprise, Leander corrected, coming to take the brush from her hands so he could do the brushing himself. A nightly ritual they both enjoyed. A wonderful, exhausting, final surprise, Isadora said firmly. 4 children is quite enough. More than enough, really. We're outnumbered as it is. I suppose you're right. But he was smiling in a way that suggested he wouldn't mind being wrong. Later, lying in the darkness with Leander's arms around her and the sounds of their sleeping household surrounding them, Isadora thought about that girl in the Pelham House drawing room, the one who'd cared about cutting remarks and social standing and being kept waiting. She seemed like a character from a book now, someone Isadora had read about rather than been. That girl would never recognize the life Isadora led now, the early mornings woken by children climbing into bed, the afternoons spent resolving sibling disputes and kissing scraped knees, the evenings reading stories until her voice went hoarse. That girl would probably think it was beneath a duchess to spend quite so much time in the nursery, to let her expensive dresses get ruined by small hands covered in jam or mud or paint. But that girl had never felt what it was like to be truly loved, to be part of something bigger and more important than social standing or fashion or society's approval, to have someone call you Mama with absolute trust and devotion, to watch the man you love become a father to 4 wildly different children and excel at it beyond measure. That girl had never known that the best things in life often arrived wrapped in the most unexpected packages. "What are you thinking about?" Leander murmured against her hair, clearly not asleep despite the late hour. "How glad I am that you were late," Isadora said simply. "How grateful I am for every seemingly small decision that led us here. Your tardiness, Tess's insistence on coming, my decision to kneel down in an expensive dress instead of delivering cutting remarks. All of it. Sometimes I think about Thomas," Leander said quietly, "about how much he sacrificed to give Tess life, how he loved her enough to hold on as long as he did, despite wanting to be with Caroline. I wish he could see her now, confident and happy and loved. I wish he could meet Thomas, his namesake, could see the family we've built. I think he knows," Isadora said softly. "Wherever he is, I think he knows his daughter is safe and loved and thriving. That's all any parent wants." "It is," Leander agreed, "and we've given her that, given all of them that. A home where they're safe to be exactly who they are, where love is abundant, where family means everything. We really have created something wonderful, haven't we? We really have." He pulled her closer, his lips finding hers in a kiss that still made her heart race even after 6 years of marriage. "I love you, Isadora Vaux, more than I thought possible, more than I have words to express adequately." "I love you too," she whispered against his mouth. "Forever and always, just like I promised Tess that first day." "Forever and always," he echoed. "The best promise you ever made." And lying there in the darkness, surrounded by the family they'd built from the most unlikely beginnings, Isadora knew he was right. Forever had started the day a duke arrived late to their first meeting, bringing unexpected company, and it would continue for all the days to come. The end. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. If this story made you smile, cry, or reflect on the beauty of family and second chances, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, share it with someone you love, and let us know your thoughts in the comments. Your support, truly from the bottom of our hearts, keeps this channel alive and inspires us to keep telling stories filled with love, redemption, and unforgettable twists of fate. And remember, at the end of this video you'll see another beautiful story suggestion from our channel. Click and be surprised by more emotional tales just like this one. See you there. Thank you for being here, the Legends of Love team.